Hello! In this video we're going to talk a little bit about arguments and a notion called validity. And these are basic concepts that we're going to be using to think about whether or not reasoning is good or bad. So consider this little piece of reasoning. My friend is at the Starbucks or the Coffee Bean. My friend is not at the Coffee Bean, so my friend is at the Starbucks. And suppose that we knew the premises. Well, should we believe the conclusion? Yes, we definitely should. The conclusion follows from the premises, right? The first premise says there's one of these two places. Second premise says not at this one. That means have to be at the other one. So the conclusion follows from the premises. So we call those three claims an argument. So colloquially, by argument, you might mean two people having a disagreement about some idea. But we're using the word argument in a slightly different way. When we reason, we draw a conclusion from some premises, as we just saw, right? The premises where my friend is at the Starbucks or the Coffee Bean, and my friend is not at, not at the Coffee Bean, and the conclusion was my friend is at the Starbucks. So we're just going to use the word argument as a name for the premises and the conclusion together. So when we're just saying here are some premises and here's a conclusion, that just is an argument. And then we can ask, is it a good argument or a bad argument? A good argument is supposed to give us reason to believe that the conclusion is true. That's what makes it a good argument. We make a good step in reasoning if we go from the premises to the conclusion, or if the premises support, if we should believe the conclusion. So there are two aspects, at least, of arguments that can make them good. Good arguments need to have both of these. First of all, the premises need to be true. If the premises aren't true, we're not going anywhere from them. And secondly, the conclusion needs to follow from the premises. And it's this notion of following that we're going to be looking at in this video. So you might think at least if the conclusion follows from the premises, there should at least be the following, that if the premises are true, so is the conclusion. The conclusion is true if the premises are. But there's a little bit more to following than that. So here's an argument. Premise 1, the Earth is spherical. Conclusion, so Drake is famous. And this is one of the arguments that are in the argument survey. And if you haven't taken that argument survey, you should probably stop this video and do that now. You'll find the rest of this video a little bit more informative if you've taken that survey first. But so supposing you've done that, okay, we can ask, does the conclusion follow from the premises? And it doesn't. The conclusion does not follow. There's a counterexample, right? The Earth could be spherical, and yet Drake could not be famous, right? Maybe he had a very different upbringing or something, and he never became the famous person that he is. So in this case, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. It's not even the case that if the premises are true, then no matter what, so is the conclusion. Here's a different argument. Premise 1, Rex barks. Premise 2, Rex likes to chase balls. Premise 3, Rex is brown and furry. Premise 4, Rex weighs 30 pounds. Conclusion, Rex is a dog. Well, on the one hand, the premises do not guarantee the conclusion. Maybe, we can imagine that it's possible that the premises be true and the conclusion false. Maybe Rex is a very large hamster or whatever. Rex is a cat with a strange voice, or who knows, right? There are different ways in which the premises could be true and the conclusion false. We can, produce counterexamples to the argument where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Still, this argument is better than the previous argument. Why? Well, at least in this case, the conclusion is, while not guaranteed to be true, it's fairly likely to be true if the premises are. In the previous argument, we want to say if that premise is true, the Earth is spherical. Is the conclusion true? No. But in this case, you think, well, yeah, at least maybe, and maybe even probably, or very likely, if the premises are true. So is the conclusion. Still, while this is a better argument, it's not a perfect argument, and in philosophy, we tend to look for a different kind of argument. There's nothing wrong with this argument, and as it stands, it's a fine argument, and science uses arguments like these all the time. But there's a different kind of arguments that are in certain ways even better that we look for in philosophy a lot. So, what are they like? Well, here's an argument. You might think premise 1, Spot is a dog. Conclusion, Spot is a mammal. You might think, hey, this is a good argument. The premise does guarantee the conclusion. But it's not a perfect argument. It's still missing. It's still lacking. And a way to see that is to compare the the first argument with this second argument. Premise 1, Spot is a dog. Conclusion, Spot can fly. So that's a bad argument, right? Again, we think if the premise is true, is the conclusion also true? No. But how do we know the difference between these two arguments? Well, it's because we know about dogs and mammals and flight. You have to actually know more than is stated in these arguments to tell is the argument good or the argument bad. They're different, right? The first one is definitely better than the second one. In the first one, no matter what, if the premises are true, so is the conclusion. The premise guarantees the conclusion. But to tell that the premise guarantees the conclusion, you can't look just at the argument. You need to appeal to your background knowledge about dogs and mammals and flight. So we might think that while in the first case there's a closer tie between the premise and the conclusion than in the second case, probably we also want to say that in both cases a premise is missing from the argument. So here's a better argument. Premise 1, Spot is a dog. Premise 2, every dog is a mammal. Conclusion, Spot is a mammal. So this is a good argument because we've added the missing premise. There are actually a bunch of premises we could have put in there. We could have said if Spot is a dog, then Spot is a mammal. But there's this more general premise, every dog is a mammal. And when we add a missing premise, then we get a very good argument. And now this is a very good argument. No matter what, if the premises are true, so is the conclusion. But also, nothing has been left out, right? It's all stated in the premises, everything you need to know that the conclusion is true. So here's another argument. Rex is a dinosaur. Every dinosaur is friendly, so Rex is friendly. Well, this too is a good argument. Nothing is missing in either of these arguments, right? Everything is explicit. Everything you need to know to tell that if the premises are true, so is the conclusion, is stated in the premises. So another way of thinking about this is to say that the arguments have the same form. So the premise 1 is A is an F, so A would be either Rex or Spot. F would be dog or dinosaur, and then premise 2, we could say every F, so either dog or dinosaur is, and then either a mammal or friendly, and so we can say conclusion, so A, either Rex or Spot, is G, either friendly or a dinosaur. So these two arguments both have this form that we see displayed here. They're both of the, and any argument that has that form is also going to be a good argument. That argument is, if its premises are true, then so is its conclusion. Any argument that has the form there, if the premises of that argument are true, the conclusion of that argument is true. So these are more, right, that we've seen now two sort of super good arguments. These two we have on the screen here, and we can say two things about them. No matter what, if the premises are true, so is the conclusion. And we can also say that nothing has been left out, that everything is explicit, that the connection between the premises and the conclusion doesn't rely on your knowing anything about dogs and mammals and Spot, or dinosaurs and friendliness. It's because of the form of the argument. So an argument like this we call valid. So valid arguments, I've sort of said this before, but now I'm going to say it very explicitly and have it on the screen. And you really want to have this in your notes, it's in the slides that are down below here, the video. But here's the definition of validity, and you should again have it in your notes. First of all, no matter what, if the premises are true, so is the conclusion. So if an argument is valid, then it's like then no matter what, if the argument's premises are true, then the conclusion is true. But that's the case for the Spot is a dog, Spot is a mammal argument, and that argument's not valid. There's more to validity than that. So we also want to say that nothing is left out, that the argument doesn't rely on background knowledge, everything is explicit, the premises guarantee the conclusion because of the argument's form. And those are all different ways of basically saying the same thing. And we have, just because we're human, it's part of being human, some ability to reason validly. It's just part of what our brains are able to do. But we're not perfect at it, and we don't often think about it in these terms. So in this class, if you were taking a logic class, then we define more sharply what validity is, and we look at some sort of specific ways to figure out whether or not an argument is valid. But we're not going to do that in this class, but we are going to work with this intuitive notion of validity that we all have, that, yeah, when you have an argument where no matter what, if the premises are true, so is the conclusion, and you've said everything you need to say, you haven't left anything out, that it's because of the argument's form that the premises and conclusion are connected, okay, that's a valid argument. And those are the kinds of arguments that we're going to be looking for in this class. So we want valid arguments. We'll be trying to formulate valid arguments. We'll be asking whether or not, when we are presented with an argument by an author, we'll be asking, is the argument valid or not? And there are two ways to, so we just saw the definition of validity. There are two sort of natural ways to show that an argument is not valid. One is to produce a counterexample, like we did with the Drake argument. Sometimes you can't produce actually a counterexample, like the spot is a dog, spot is a mammal argument. But you can say, and in other cases you might think, well, I'm not sure if I can produce a counterexample. Like with the spot is a dog, spot is a mammal argument, there are no counterexamples. I know there are no counterexamples. There's nothing that's a dog that isn't a mammal. But I can still say it's not valid by saying that it's missing a premise. Okay, so there are two ways to show that an argument is not valid. One is to produce a counterexample, and the other is to show that a premise is missing, that there's some unstated assumption is required to connect the stated premises with the conclusion. Okay, so there's a quiz. So there was the argument survey, and then there's an arguments quiz, and that is going to have 4 arguments, and you're going to have to say whether or not they're valid. So what you're asking is, do they have those two properties? Is the argument like this, no matter what, if the premises are true, the conclusion is true, and that nothing has been left out, that everything is explicit? Or instead, the conclusion could be true, could be false, even while the premises are true, or you're not sure about that, but you can see that there's a missing premise. Okay, those are the questions you're going to want to ask when you take that quiz and you're presented with the 4 arguments, and you're going to want to know, are they valid or not? So you might find it helpful while taking that quiz to have the definition of validity written out and ask yourself, okay, does the argument have those two properties or not? Okay, so good luck with the quiz. If you have any questions, let me know.